The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 4, The American Founding and the Federal Era. Chapter 4, The Constitutional Convention, 1787, and Chapter 5, The Framers of the Constitution, as well as Chapter 6, The Constitution, the Bible, and the Declaration. In an attempt to solve the flaws in the national government, in the late spring of 1787, delegates from across the country met together at the State House in Philadelphia, also known as Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. While many were prepared to make changes to the Articles, the Virginia delegates, led by James Madison, proposed a new governing document. The initial reaction by the other delegates was hesitancy and doubt, for they believed that the people would oppose any dramatic change and would therefore fail. They viewed milder half measures as far more acceptable. When the convention began, George Washington, chosen by the other delegates to preside over the assembly, addressed them in a brief but powerful speech. He agreed that it was indeed, quote, probable that no plan we propose will be adopted, end quote, but warned that if this occurred, America might have to endure another dreadful war. He therefore challenged the delegates to be bold, telling them, quote, if to please the people we offer what ourselves disapprove, how can we afterward defend our work, end quote. He concluded by urging the delegates to, quote, raise a standard, end quote, of the best government they could possibly devise, no matter how much change it required, and then trust that, quote, the event is in the hands of God, end quote. They accepted his challenge, but the way forward was neither easy nor smooth. After only a few weeks of deliberations, the Constitutional Convention was on the verge of collapse. For more than a month, the delegates were deadlocked on different issues, such as the representation of citizens and states in Congress. With this impasse and no real progress, patience was wearing thin and emotions were on edge. At this point, Benjamin Franklin, the oldest delegate, he was then 81 years old at a time when the average lifespan in America was only 33, asked for permission to speak. On previous occasions, he wrote his remarks and had someone else read them, but this time, Franklin was stirred to address the delegates personally. He told them, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they that labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service. While even a secularist would recognize that these 11 sentences carry a general religious overtone, he would likely miss the many specific biblical ideas, references, and quotes in this brief speech, which include, number 1, groping in the dark. That's found in Job 12:25. 2, the Father of lights in James 1:17. 3, illuminate our understanding, James 1:5. 4, a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, Matthew 10:29, as well as Luke 12:6. Number 5, can an empire rise without his aid, Daniel 4:17 and Psalm 75:7. Number 6, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it, Psalm 127:1. 7, the builders of Babel, Genesis 11:1-9. And 8, a reproach and a byword, found in Deuteronomy 28:37, 2 Chronicles 7:20, 1 Kings 9:7, as well as Psalm 44:14. Many Americans now know so little of the Bible that they no longer recognize these Bible ideas, references, and phrases. Unless speakers today announce they are citing a specific scripture verse, listeners usually don't recognize such quotations. Americans are now in the same general situation as the citizens of Europe that Franklin described to a prominent minister. It was not necessary in New England, where everybody reads the Bible and is acquainted with scripture phrases, that you should note the Bible texts from which you took them. But I have observed in England as well as in France that verses and expressions taken from the sacred writings and not known to be such appear very strange and awkward to some readers. As Franklin affirmed in the Founders' Day, they didn't need to tell Americans where that thought came from or which Bible verses they were quoting, for all had learned to read from the Bible and studied it in school and knew and recognized its phrases and ideas. But in secular France and England, as in much of America today, citizens were generally biblically illiterate, so they needed scriptural citations to identify when a quotation came from the Bible. Roger Sherman of Connecticut seconded Franklin's motion for prayer, but then Hugh Williamson, a licensed minister of North Carolina, pointed out that they had no funds to pay the salary of a full-time chaplain. Edmund Randolph of Virginia then proposed that a sermon be preached at the request of the convention on the 4th of July, the anniversary of independence, and that thenceforward prayer would be used in the convention every morning. Given those considerations, Franklin's motion was not addressed or voted on, but the Constitutional Convention recessed for 3 days, attended church, and listened to patriotic orations. They gathered at the Calvinist Reformed Church in Philadelphia, and the Reverend William Rogers prayed a special prayer over the delegates. We fervently recommend to thy fatherly notice our federal convention. Favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence. Be thou their wisdom and their strength. enable them to devise such measures as may prove happily instrumental for healing all divisions and promoting the good of the great whole, that the United States of America may furnish the world with one example of a free and permanent government. May we continue, under the influence of republican virtue, to partake of all the blessings of cultivated and civilized society. When the delegates reconvened, there was a change in the atmosphere. They slowly began making progress. Throughout those long and difficult days, a somber George Washington sometimes despaired of success. But they eventually solved the major problematic issues. This resulted in the best form of government ever devised by man, and the U.S. Constitution has proven to be the most valuable and stable civil document in history. No nation has been under the same Constitution longer than the United States. The 55 individuals who penned the Constitution were a diverse group, but very representative of America at the time. For example, most were open and active Christians. Among their number were James McHenry, founder of the Maryland Bible Society; Rufus King, a founder of the New York Committee Prayer Book Society; Roger Sherman, author of several Christian theological pieces; Abraham Baldwin, who was offered the Professor of Divinity and Theology at Yale; Alexander Hamilton, who proposed the Christian Constitutional Society; John Langdon and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, founders of the American Bible Society, and many others. Some came from large cities such as James Wilson from Philadelphia and Nathaniel Gorham from Boston, and others from remote rural areas such as John Dickinson from his farm in Delaware and Daniel Carroll from his in Maryland. Among them were professors, businessmen, farmers, soldiers, attorneys, ministers, physicians, and political leaders. Some were young, such as Jonathan Dayton, age 26, and Charles Pinckney, age 29. Others were old, such as Benjamin Franklin, 81, and Roger Sherman, 66. Some were regular in attendance, such as James Madison, who attended every meeting, while others attended few sessions, like William Pierce. And 8 of the 55 were immigrants, including Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, and William Patterson. Several kept written notes of the proceedings, such as Robert Yates and William Patterson, but James Madison kept the most extensive ones. And other delegates, including Benjamin Franklin and Charles Pinckney, gave Madison the text of their key speeches for him to include in his notes. From these records, we know that some delegates spoke often during the debates, such as Gouverneur Morris, who spoke 173 times, James Wilson 168 times, Roger Sherman 147, while others were relatively quiet. William Livingston only spoke 2 times, and William Few did not speak at all. Several different proposals for the Constitution were offered, including the Virginia Plan, introduced by James Madison, the New Jersey Plan by William Patterson, and the New York Plan by Alexander Hamilton. The delegates approved none of these plans in their entirety, but useful elements were taken from each to form various compromises. Many delegates contributed significant ideas that led to distinctive features in the final document. For example, Roger Sherman and his Connecticut Compromise helped resolve the contentious debate over representation. His plan provided proportional representation of states in the House and equal representation of states in the Senate. James Wilson took the principles from Sherman's compromise and applied them to the selection of the president, resulting in what is called the Electoral College. The Electoral College was a brilliant innovation that gave not just the people, but also the states a voice in choosing a president. If they elected the president that time solely by the national popular vote, the 4 largest states could have outvoted the other 9, thus giving the smaller states less voice and less protection in the election. Today, if the popular vote took the place of the Electoral College, an idea currently advocated by many progressives, a similar problem would result. Under a national popular vote, our 7 most populous states have enough votes to choose the president, essentially making the other 43 states irrelevant. Similarly, there are some 35,000 cities in America, but the 20 largest cities have sufficient numbers to choose the president in a national popular vote, thus excluding the voice of tens of thousands of other cities. To prevent this, the Electoral College ensures that every state, even the least populous ones, can have some level of influence on the election. It requires that the winning candidate have not just a sizable portion of the popular vote, but also that the total vote be spread out among enough states to win a majority of the electoral votes from across the nation. Currently, a candidate must win 270 electoral votes from the states to become president. To garner this many electoral votes today means that for a candidate to become president, he or she must win at least all 12 of the most populous states, or 39 of the least populous, including Washington, D.C., or some combination of the both. The actual numbers have varied over the years, depending on internal demographic population shifts in varying states, but the overall principle has been the same for the past 2 centuries. It is not enough just to win the national popular vote, but the total vote must be spread out among numerous states. This brilliant and timeless plan devised by the founders has resulted in more peaceful national elections than in any other nation in the world. Just as Roger Sherman and James Wilson had a direct influence in shaping key provisions of the Constitution, other delegates also made significant contributions. As James Madison acknowledged, the Constitution was, quote, ought to be regarded as the work of many heads and many hands, end quote. Today, many academics and writers act as if the Constitution sprang fully formed from Madison's head, calling him the single father of the Constitution, virtually ignoring the rest of the founders. But previous generations recognized the contributions of many, including not only James Wilson, but also Charles Pinckney, one early work called Pinckney, the Father of the Constitution. U.S. President James Monroe, like many others, gave George Washington great credit, arguing that without his leadership, the Constitutional Convention would have adjourned unsuccessfully. And an eminent historian in 1886 identified the master builders of the Constitution as Roger Sherman, George Washington, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Why has Madison now become the single identified force behind the Constitution for many writers and academics today? Perhaps it is because of his detached memoranda, which criticized governmental religious activities and expressions of religion. Significantly, Madison did not make this work public, and it is believed that many of his closest friends were unfamiliar with it. This work was not known to the public until 1946. On its discovery, secularists immediately began using it as a tool to attack public expressions of Christianity. In that work, Madison specifically suggested that presidents shouldn't issue calls for prayer, and that Congress shouldn't have chaplains. But modern courts using this work have gone far beyond that, citing it to stop religious activities in schools and other public venues not even remotely related to presidents or Congress. Although secularists today like to claim Madison as one of their own, His public actions indicate that he was not the sort of separationist that modern activist groups wish him to be. For example, as a young man, Madison encouraged a close friend to make sure of his own spiritual salvation and then boldly and publicly proclaim his Christian testimony to all. And he urged others to do the same. Additionally, Madison helped author the 1776 Virginia Bill of Rights, which declared that, quote, "It is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other," end quote. He served on the congressional committee that authorized, approved, and selected paid congressional chaplains. He signed a federal bill that provided federal economic aid to a Bible society in its goal of the mass distribution of the Bible. And he issued 4 presidential proclamations calling for national days of prayer and fasting and Thanksgiving. Secular-minded writers, ignoring these actions and finding Madison's change of mind late in life, as outlined in his detached memoranda, to be extremely helpful to their secularist agenda, have elevated him to the principal authority on the Constitution. However, Madison himself personally rejected any such position, telling one early admirer, "Oh, you give me credit to which I have no claim in calling me the writer of the Constitution of the United States. This was not, like the fabled goddess of wisdom, the offspring of a single brain." There is no question of Madison's important influence during the Constitutional Convention, but there is also no question that he was often out of step with the other delegates. For instance, 40 of the 71 proposals he made during the convention were voted down, and his famed Virginia plan was drastically different from the final document. Furthermore, at the end of the convention, it was Gouverneur Morris, and not James Madison, whom the other delegates selected to head the committee assigned to create the actual wording of the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was the result of many wise minds, each of whom contributed in some way to the final product that has so directly blessed Americans across the centuries and indirectly blessed so many other nations. As President Calvin Coolidge affirmed, quote, "No other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. The good it has wrought can never be measured," end quote. He correctly concluded that, quote, "To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race," end quote. It is common for contemporary scholars and activists to assert that the American government in general and the U.S. Constitution in particular are secular and were intentionally designed to be so. One modern book reflecting this belief is The Godless Constitution. But is this title accurate? Is the Constitution a godless and secular document? Certainly not. The evidence is abundant that many of the seminal ideas in the Constitution reflected the Christian thinking of the preceding 2 centuries. 2 noted political scientists examined numerous political writings from the founding era. They found that by a wide margin, the most cited authority in those writings was the Bible. 34% of the documented quotes came from the Bible, a percentage almost 4 times higher than the second most quoted source. Significantly, these scholars actually undercounted references to the Bible because they looked only for citations. But as already demonstrated, America's founders routinely referenced the Bible and quoted verbatim from it without providing the direct citation. As well, these scholars excluded from their study political sermons that only cited the Bible. Had other political sermons been included, there would be far more citations to the scriptures. Yet, it is still an impressive 34%, even at their low count. Another indication that the Constitution was not secular is that the founders insisted it be used side by side with the Declaration of Independence, which explicitly references God on multiple occasions. While many secularists today flatly dismiss the importance of the Declaration and assert that it is not a binding governmental document, the historical evidence refuting those claims is abundant. The founders made it clear that there was no either-or choice between the Declaration and Constitution, but rather that the two documents must be used simultaneously side by side. As Samuel Adams reminded Americans, before the formation of this Constitution, this Declaration of Independence was received and ratified by all the states in the Union and has never been disannulled. For this reason, the Constitution dates itself to the Declaration, and federal laws passed since 1789 likewise date to the Declaration, not the Constitution. Furthermore, the admission of territories as states to the United States was often predicated on an assurance by the new state that it would uphold not only the specifics of the Constitution, but also the principles of the Declaration. Previous generations understood that the Constitution could not be properly interpreted apart from the God-centric principles and values in the Declaration. As John Quincy Adams affirmed, the virtue which had been infused into the Constitution of the United States was no other than the concretion of those abstract principles which had been first proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. This was the platform upon which the Constitution of the United States had been erected. Its virtues, its republican character, consisted in its conformity to the principles proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1897 likewise attested. The latter, Constitution, is but the body and the letter of which the former, Declaration of Independence, is the thought and the spirit, and it is always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. A violation of the general principles in the Declaration is just as serious as a violation of the specific provisions in the Constitution. Understanding this, Abraham Lincoln reminded citizens, our founding fathers established these great self-evident truths that their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew that battle which their fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land. Now, my countrymen, if you have been taught doctrines conflicting with the great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, let me entreat you to come back. Come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution cannot be properly understood or applied apart from the biblically based principles set forth in the Declaration.